When we think about the greatest movie villains of all time, only one fictional character casting the most terror into the human heart stood out, and that is Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. The seductive vampire from Stoker's 1897 gothic horror novel has appeared in over 200 screen adaptations around the world. Though Dracula may seem like a fictional creation, Stoker in fact drew inspiration from a real-life man with an even more grotesque taste for blood. In the summer of 1890, a 45-year-old Bram Stoker entered the subscription library in Whitby, England, and requested a specific title: The Accounts of Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson, written in 1820. This wasn't a title found readily on the shelves or typically made available to the general public. The library didn't even make it known they possessed the rare book. Access was only granted to those who asked for it. Patrons handled the title only under the watchful eye of the librarian, and it was returned to its resting place the moment business concluded. Upon receipt of the book, Stoker opened the pages to a specific section, made notes in his journal, and returned the tome to the librarian. He stopped next at the Whitby Museum, where he reviewed a series of maps and pieced together a route beginning in the heart of London and ending upon a mountaintop deep within the wilderness of Romania. From the museum, Stoker then made his way to Whitby Harbour, where he spoke to several members of the Royal Coast Guard. They provided details of a sailing vessel, the Dimitri, that ran aground a few years earlier on the beach inside the protective harbour, with only a handful of the remaining crew alive. The ship, which originated in Varna, an Eastern European port, was carrying a mysterious cargo, crates of earth. While investigating the damaged ship, rescue workers reported seeing a large black dog, consistent with a Yorkshire myth of a beast known as Barghest, escape from the hull of the ship and run up the 199 steps from Tate Sands Beach into the graveyard of St. Mary's Church. Stoker looked up at the church, at Whitby Abbey looming beside it on the cliff. In his mind's eye, he pictured the dark chamber at the top of the central tower. Opening his journal, he turned the information he'd written down back at the library, and 4 months later, a story began to take shape. When Bram Stoker wrote his iconic novel, he never intended for Dracula to serve as fiction, but as a warning of a very real evil, a childhood nightmare, all too real. Worried of the impact of presenting such a story as true, his editor returned the manuscript with a single word of his own: no. He went on to explain that London was still recovering from a spate of horrible murders in Whitechapel, and with the killer still on the loose, they couldn't publish such a story without running the risk of generating mass panic. Changes would need to be made, factual elements would need to come out, and it would be published as fiction, or not at all. When the novel was finally released on May 26, 1897, the first 101 pages had been cut. Numerous alterations had been made to the text, and the epilogue had been shortened, changing Dracula's ultimate fate as well as that of his castle. Tens of thousands of words had vanished. Bram's message, once concise and clear, had blurred between the remaining lines. In the 1980s, the original Dracula manuscript was discovered in a barn in rural northwestern Pennsylvania. Nobody knows how it made its way across the Atlantic. That manuscript, now owned by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, begins on page 102. Jonathan Harker's journey on a train, once thought to be the beginning of the story, was actually in the thick of it. This raises a question. What was on the first 101 pages? What was considered so real, so frightening for publication? Some of these clues were discovered in the recently translated first edition from Iceland, titled Power of Darkness. Within that first section, Stoker left parts of his original story outside the reach of his UK publisher. Some other clues were found in other versions of his iconic book, including his notes, his journal, and other first editions worldwide. Unable to tell his story as a whole, Stoker has spread it out, where, much like his famous vampire, it never died, only slept, waited. However, unlike the fictional character in his book, the real person he was inspired by, when he first entered the library in Whitby, had been real, and he had been even more barbarous and savage. This is the true story of a real-life person named Vlad Dracula. So folks, lock your doors, shut your windows, turn down your lights, and come with me into the other side.
Is anyone here? What did you find?
You are listening to Supernatural Confessions.
Vlad III Dracula, 1431, died 1477, was one of the most important rulers in Wallachian history. Wallachia is a historical region of modern-day Romania. He was also known as Vlad the Impaler for the brutality with which he dispensed with his enemies, gaining him notoriety in 15th century Europe. The name Dracul was given to Vlad's father, Vlad II, by his fellow knights who belonged to a Christian crusading order known as the Order of the Dragon. Dracul translates to dragon in Romanian. In 1431, King Sigismund of Hungary, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor, inducted the elder Vlad into the knightly order. The Order of the Dragon was devoted to one task: the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had gained control of Wallachia and its neighboring countries, and there had been much tension and resentment against their rule. His son, Vlad III, would become known as the son of Dracul, or in Old Romanian, Draculia, hence Dracula. In modern Romanian, the word drac refers to the devil. Vlad III was born in 1431 in the state of Wallachia, now the southern region of present-day Romania. It was one of the three principalities that made up Romania at the time, along with Transylvania and modern-day Moldova. Situated between Christian Europe and the Muslim lands of the Ottoman Empire, Wallachia was the scene of a great number of bloody battles. As Ottoman forces pushed westward, Christian crusaders marched eastward toward the Holy Land, and Wallachia became the site of constant turmoil. In 1442, Vlad accompanied his father and his 7-year-old brother Radu on the diplomatic mission in the heart of the Ottoman Empire. However, the three were captured and held hostage by the Ottomans. Their captors told Vlad II that he could be released on one condition: that his 2 sons remain behind. Believing it was the safest option for his family, Vlad II agreed. The boys were held in a citadel atop a rocky precipice over the town of Agrigods, now known as Drogrogods, in present-day Turkey. During the 5 years of captivity in the fortress, Vlad and his brother were taught lessons in the art of war, science, and philosophy. In time, Radu grew very close to the Sultan Mehmed II, with some people suggesting they were having an intimate relationship. Vlad was profoundly disgusted by the relationship his brother had with the Ottoman ruler, and some accounts state that he was subjected to torture and beatings, fueling his hatred of the Ottomans and making him seek refuge in learning the arts of combat. Upon his return to his land, Vlad's father was overthrown in a coup orchestrated by local warlords and killed in the marshes behind his house, while his older son, Massacre II, was tortured, blinded, and buried alive. Vlad III was eventually freed shortly after his family's death. However, by then he had already developed a taste for violence and blood. To consolidate power and assert his dominance, he decided to hold a banquet and invited hundreds of members of his rival families. Knowing his authority would be challenged, he had his guests stabbed and their still twitching bodies impaled on spikes. By 1462, he had succeeded to the Wallachian throne and was at war with the Ottomans. With enemy forces 3 times the size of his own, Vlad ordered his men to poison wells and burn crops. He also paid diseased men to infiltrate and infect the enemy. His victims were often disemboweled, beheaded, and skinned or boiled alive. However, impalement came to be his killing method of choice, largely because it was also a form of torture, as impaling involved a wooden or metal pole inserted through the lower orifices into the victim's mouth, shoulders, or neck. It would often take hours, if not days, for the victim to finally die. Vlad's ruthless brutality, combined with his sadistic methods of torturing his foes, were legendary. His cruelty went unchallenged and unabated, and his infamy and reputation spread through 15th century Europe. What made Vlad's reputation so infamously perennial is his penchant for extreme violence, with 7 of his worst crimes as documented. 1. The gory sacking of Brasov. In April 1459, Vlad attacked the Transylvanian city of Brasov, burning buildings, pillaging, and having large numbers of men, women, and children impaled on the hill by the chapel of St. Jacob. According to an illustrated account published in Nuremberg in 1499, at the bloodbath of Brasov, Dracula requested that a table be set up outside in the midst of those being impaled. There, next to where his victims were writhing and moaning on wooden stakes, he sat down for an al fresco lunch. It is said that he ate some bread after dipping it in the blood pouring down from one of the sufferers. 2. The burning of the beggars. Vlad loved to burn things, living up to his last name, which means son of the dragon. There were many occasions when Vlad was said to have had enemy combatants or the people of towns and villages he was sacking roasted alive. One particularly nasty example did not occur on the battlefield. It happened at a banquet in a great hall in Vlad's capital of Târgoviște. According to a story found in several 15th century chronicles, Vlad invited a large group of local people who have been variously described as old, lame, or beggars. He lavished his unsuspecting guests with a feast, and they ate and drank long into the night. The prince then locked the diners inside the hall and told his guards to set the building on fire. Vlad was said to have remarked at the time, "These men live off the sweat of others, so they are useless to humanity." 3. The Forest of the Impaled. In 1462, about 60 miles from Târgoviște, Sultan Mehmed II, who had led his army west to destroy Vlad, and his men were stopped in their tracks by a grisly sight. It was what one contemporary historian called a field of stakes, and must have resembled a forest of impaled Ottoman men, women, and children. Babies were impaled with their mothers, and rotting corpses had birds nesting in their entrails. There were about 20,000 of these dead or dying victims of the impaler, covering an area 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. Mehmed was said to have been dumbstruck and his men terrified. One of the slaughtered souls was a leading Ottoman, Hamza Pasha, who had been impaled on a stake taller than anyone else's, owing to his higher rank. Before being punctured on the pole, he had his arms and legs cut off. Typically, impalement involved either being skewered horizontally, front to back, or vertically through a bodily orifice and eventually exiting through the upper body or mouth. Often, the stake was rounded at the end rather than pointy to avoid a quick death. Sometimes, those who had really upset Vlad were impaled upside down. 4. The feet flaying torture. A favorite method of torture of Vlad's that he would mete out to Turkish prisoners was to have their feet flayed and the skin removed. The raw, bloody limb was rubbed in salt, and goats were brought up to lick the salt off with their rough tongues. 5. The Massacre of the Boas. One of Vlad's most infamous acts of brutality was his purge of the Boas. The Boas were an aristocratic ruling class in many parts of Eastern Europe, including Wallachia. Vlad, once he became prince in 1456, saw the corrupt and scheming Boas as a potential threat to his position. It was also the Boas who had laid the siege to kill his father and older brother. In Easter 1457, Vlad summoned the principality's Boas to an audience at his castle in Târgoviște. The 500 nobles gathered in the prince's great hall and were asked by Vlad how many princes they had met in their lives. Some of them said 7, others said 20, or even 30. At Vlad's command, the Boas and their attending family members were all seized and impaled alive, all together, in the palace's courtyard, so that his victims can continue to count how many more princes and other nobles of their class he had slain during their final moments of life. He then left the sea of rotting corpses on display as a warning to those who were thinking of opposing him. 6. The Impalement of the Monk. In about 1490, a Russian monastery compiled a set of 19 stories about the life of Vlad. One of these tales concerned 2 Hungarian monks who paid a visit to the prince at his capital. Vlad, according to the account, proudly showed the monks a gruesome display of some of his dead victims' mangled bodies, broken on wheels, and countless people on stakes. Vlad then asked the friars if they approved of his brand of justice. The first said that he did not, condemning the prince as merciless. The second monk, however, said that he was pleased to see Vlad punishing evildoers. Dracula had the second brother sent home with gold, and the first one impaled from the bottom up. 7. The Cauldron of Death. One medieval chronicle describes a heinous method of execution that Vlad employed from time to time. He would have a huge copper cauldron in his castle, topped with a wooden cover. In the center of the wooden lid was a hole big enough for a man's head to fit through. The pot was filled with water. A fire was lit underneath, and an unfortunate prisoner was tipped upside down and his head thrust through the hole and into the water. According to legend, Vlad had men boiled, starting from their face down. Vlad hated it when the deaths of his cooked victims did not end with dramatic effect. In one story, he had 300 locals boiled and roasted alive in batches, forcing those waiting their own cruel fate to eat the freshly cooked meat of those ahead of them, until none of them were left. Other terrible tales from the 15th century tell of atrocities where Vlad had young children roasted alive and force-fed to their mothers, who in turn had their breasts cut and force-fed to their husbands. Ultimately, Vlad's taste for violence and torture soured his relationships with other noble families in the region, and they began to turn their backs on him. The Ottomans took this opportunity to deal with Vlad by recruiting his own younger brother Radu, who had converted to Islam. The bonds of brotherhood were broken in the quest for power and religious dominance. During the siege, Vlad's wife committed suicide by jumping off one of the castle's towers to the river below. Radu's assault on Vlad's stronghold had initially failed, but it ultimately led to Vlad's downfall. Vlad left the safety of his lands to pursue an attack against Radu and his men. By this time, however, Vlad had few men left in his regiment and fewer who remained loyal to him. He went to the other noble families of Wallachia to ask for money to fund his army, but was denied, as he had strained all relationships due to his history of violence and torture. With his remaining legion, he was greatly outnumbered by Radu and lost the battle. His remaining retinue massacred. After Vlad's death, the Ottomans cut his corpse into pieces. His head was put on the pike and carried back to Constantinople to prove to the Ottoman rulers that the infamous Vlad, the son of the dragon, was finally dead.
I really don't feel good. It's not getting a
Is anyone here? What did you find?
You are listening to Supernatural Confessions.